All right, then, welcome all. I'm joined again by CivilNet host and analyst Eric Hacopian for our third podcast. This time we're going to be discussing the topic of culture, why it's important, and how Armenia can really gain traction with regards to the narratives in the world at the moment. So, Eric, thanks for your time.
It's a pleasure to be here.
This episode, we're focusing on culture. In one of your Insights episodes, you focused on culture and how to win the culture war. You even said that if you win the culture war, you can win the political war. But for our watchers who don't really understand, what is a culture war?
A culture war, in a modern context, by culture here, we don't necessarily mean, painting and art or literature. It's in a modern context, or in a political context, culture is the story that you tell about yourself to the world. And how do you explain yourself to the world? And how do you line up your narrative with the dominant ideas out there on different sides and from as many angles as possible? So successful cultures tell a story about themselves that has much broader appeal, essentially universal appeal. And win the context in which you have any political discussions, because essentially the culture war and the cultural context establishes the rules and the framework in which the political struggle happens in many instances. And in a modern world, it's really a world of public relations and narrative telling. So whoever tells the better narrative, the more dominant narrative, will frame the sort of the groundwork in which, or lay the field on which the political struggle happens in. So that's what we mean by the cultural war.
Okay, and if I understood correctly, the point you were making and are still making is that Armenia can benefit massively if it manages to fit the Armenian cause into the current narratives going on around the world with regards to culture. First off, do you think that's the case? And do you think that's happening now? Do you think that there has been a realization and a move towards that?
Well, Armenia can definitely do that. We can definitely win the cultural war. In fact, we have a much easier job of winning it than the other side does, for factual reasons, empirical reasons. But are we doing it now? We have not done so historically. I think there's some movements towards that here and there, but for the most part, no. I would even say today we're still losing a public relations war with our opponents. So no, we have the ability. The narrative is there. The storylines are there. We just have never told that narrative successfully.
I mean, what is it about Armenian society, about Armenian culture that could be spotlighted? What would be a good example?
Well, it's endless. I mean, first you have to start with the broader themes. Armenian culture is, we have a freedom narrative. There's two things that have defined our history. It's a freedom narrative and a resistance narrative. Our culture is very much based on freedom and individual freedom at that. We don't worship idols. We don't worship leaders. We value our individual rights, our ability to express ourselves. This is a culture that has essentially existed and continues to exist because it has resisted in a heroic way some of the darkest forces in history. And we're still resisting some of the darkest forces in history. So it's a combination of who you are and the way you like to live, more importantly, the way you don't like to live, which is exactly the way our opponents like to live, which is to live as subjects. Armenians are not subjects, we're citizens. We're not slaves to fascist families or dictators, or long gone dead dictators in the case of Turkey. And we're a cultural resistance. And if you look at around the world, why are the Irish popular? It's the resistance that they put up to English rule for all those years. Countless different groups of people have this resistance narrative. And we have that too, except we've never really told that narrative.
And isn't the point you're also making that when trying to win the PR battle, that there are also some other aspects that maybe shouldn't be highlighted that much.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we've sort of discussed this in the past, and I think the whole victimhood that comes out of our history, even though it's 100% true, it's also entirely irrelevant, because as crass as it is, people don't like victims and they don't like losers. And what matters is you tell the story in the context of resistance of what they tried and how they failed and what we're still doing, how we're impacting the world and how we're living, and how the people who try to oppress us, how they're living. So you have to put it in that context. Some of this is frankly uncomfortable because it really isn't about what is true. It is about what is relevant, and they're not always the same thing. So I think that's where that comes in. And the second one, we've discussed this before, is this constant, what I call this Christian narrative, which is fine, it's true, and it actually has relevance and a sort of a public market for it around the world, but it's a very limited one. And you're much better off clinging on to other parts of our narrative when Christianity is frankly becoming a less and less relevant force in the West, and constantly talking about it essentially makes you seem archaic.
And could it be that the narrative that the Armenian cause should align with is really the narrative of the Western liberal left, if it's really trying to gain traction? I mean, what do you think about that?
I think the key here is to have your narrative lined up with all kinds of different political movements and sides, because being principled is a very good individual trait, but it is utterly irrelevant when it comes to nations and peoples. You need to be opportunistic, and you need to, with this one particular group of people, you tell one narrative, and with another group of people, you tell another narrative. Consistency is not what is called for. It's opportunism, which is what is called for. So, yes, there's many things in our current situation that actually rhymes with the ideas of the left. But there's also many things that actually rhymes with the ideas of the right, as far as civilizational issues, cultural differences, Western culture versus Orientalist culture. So I think you just have to be opportunistic and not get caught in trying to be principled, which in the context of a nation state is foolishness.
So you're arguing that Armenians should be pragmatic. They should try and
ruthlessly pragmatic.
Because you mentioned that you could also gain traction with the right. I mean, the 2022 French presidential candidate Eric Zemmour recently visited Armenia, went to Khorvirab, and was kind of spotlighting the Christian aspect. So what's interesting, I think, is that some people who might criticize this approach think that it's about just gaining traction or gaining attention from the left, but it's possible, in your opinion, to do both.
Absolutely both, because first of all, both the right and the left in the West have freedom narratives. They're just different ways of saying it. There's a freedom narrative in the left, which is our desire not to have oppressors and to live free. But this is also a nation of shopkeepers and entrepreneurs who have who are doing fascinating things, cutting edge things in the world of business in some of the most difficult circumstances. So you just the narrative is endless, and there's different varieties. I mean, I always don't like to compare ourselves to Israel, but if you look at the Israeli narrative, on the one hand, they'll play the Christian right in the United States with all these Old Testament connections that they can make, while at the same time they're always highlighting gay rights in Tel Aviv and other places. And you talk to each market with a particular narrative, and if other people want to call you on your contradictions, well, you let them. That's just the nature of the project.
And I'm sure that a lot of those Israelis are cognitive of that they are appealing to both sides. You mentioned in one of your Insights episodes something which I suspect is true, that modern popular culture has dismantled every conservative structure and institution. Can you unpack this a bit for us? What do you mean when you say that?
Generally, if you look at this is mostly in the West, but not exclusively in the West. Even in places that, you know, supposedly conservative forces are winning, like in Hungary and Poland, when you go down to the younger people, when you go down to urban people, the more affluent people, their attitudes mirror Western Europe. Again, modern popular culture, which I think this is a very broad term because it really includes some of the crassest parts of culture, or modern technology, social media, is the most powerful force in history. Nothing else comes close to it, and its ability to disrupt dominant historical narratives and create, I think it was Zygmunt Bauman who came up with this idea of liquid modernity, where there's nothing solid, that everything old gets broken. And you see this, and there is not a force in the world that's been able to stop it. Whether it's, you know, the supreme leaders of the world, or religious leaders, or traditional structures, family structures, they have all melted in front of this force, primarily because it is so attractive. Almost every other historical, political, or cultural movement demands sacrifice of its members, of its adherents, people who adhere to it. Modern popular culture only demands that you are passively entertained and to maximize your pleasure. And if you can have a political movement, if that argument will always win over whatever is the opposite to require sacrifice, or you know, a pain, whatever you need to give to get something. This is something where everything is made much easier. So it's by far the most attractive narrative, and it's winning the day everywhere. Yeah, and you just have to understand that.
And you've been in Armenia for some years now. Have you noticed that even in Armenia, the crescendo of modern popular culture, particularly with young people, is quite interesting?
Absolutely. And again, we have to understand that it doesn't matter if something like this is has 10 or 15% of the population. It's what 10 or 15% are you talking about? Are you talking about the most affluent, youngest, best educated? Because if that's the case, 30 years from now, everybody will believe that, because those are the people that set the trends in every society. Now, we've all seen it, you know. Every Christmas season now, you see Black Friday signs all over Armenia, sometimes even translated into Armenian, which is even more ridiculous. And people don't understand the background of what Black Friday means, which is the day that companies actually become profitable. So it's become like you have Black Friday, you have Valentine's Day that's become very big here, Halloween, all of these Western traditions which have almost nothing to do with Armenia and Armenians. But this wave is passing through us. Even on things like LGBT rights, among the younger, hipper crowd, urban crowd in Armenia, the attitudes are entirely different than for their parents. And all of this is driven by social media and popular culture, because they just replicate what they see, and the attractiveness of popular culture overwhelms everything else.
Okay. I want to go through some of the narratives now, and you give me your opinion. Is this something that should be pushed or not pushed, or who should it be pushed to? The first one you briefly mentioned, but a common narrative that goes along with being Armenian is that Armenians suffered the first genocide of the 20th century. This is obviously pushed a lot. What do you think of it? What do you think could be changed? Who should it be directed to, or should it not be pushed at all?
No, it should be. It should be pushed in the sense that it empowers us to talk about this topic from a point of authority. For example, if the Rohingya are in danger, we have the moral authority to talk about it, much more so than other people do.
Right.
Why is Erdogan commenting on defending the Rohingya and not our government?
Right.
So it's a question of using our history as a platform to be able to, in some ways, impose your narrative and your will upon the world, saying, this is what happened to us. We won't let it happen again. And this is, we have a special right to talk about these things and a special authority that you need to listen to. So I think you talk about your pain in the context of the universalization of your pain and the privatization of your gain. That's really the sort of the short outline. So you need to be able to take what happened to us and universalize it, and not make it exclusive. I think this is the hardest part, because we think what happened to us was unique, and what happened to us was unique. But in the context of telling a narrative, that's not what's going to win people over. What's going to win people over is this happened, Cambodia happened, Bosnia happened, and the reason they happened is because people didn't address our issues. And we have a moral authority to talk about these things. So I think you need to do something that your issues have much bigger relevance to the world, that they're not individualized in that context.
Another narrative is the self-determination of the people of Artsakh. You've mentioned before that, in a sense, Azerbaijan won the PR war in several countries around the world, especially prior to the 2020 war. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I think you have to look at it. They bought a portion of that, and they won another portion of it.
Right.
If you spend enough money, there's enough degenerates in the West and think tanks or journalists that you get them to write anything. So that's not what I'm discussing. But even beyond that, what is the heroic struggle of a people against state fascism, which is the struggle of the people of Artsakh against state fascism that is genocidal in nature, became an argument about territorial integrity and the territorial integrity of borders drawn by Stalin, of all people. So that's how we lost that narrative. What should have been is, this was a heroic resistance and a victory in the early 90s of people who resisted genocide and ethnic cleansing, fighting a fascist state and a fascist ideology, which is the dominant political, cultural narrative in Azerbaijan right now. It's the cultural identity is based on, is more partially built on hatred of Armenians. And there's frankly no other state in Europe that you can say that about. So instead of, they managed to turn, because we never told that story in a successful way, or even attempted to tell that story, it became something about who's occupying whose lands from a very legalistic perspective. It is almost, if you ever want to win any argument, you tell the moral story and not the legal one. The legal one is always secondary. What is the moral story here? And the moral story was, this was a heroic struggle that still continues to today against genocidal fascism. And you ask the world, which side are you on? That's how we lost that argument. And we're still losing that argument because we're still not making the proper case that we should be making.
And you're very familiar with the West. I just want to ask, what do you think of those journalists and lobbyists, Western guys, educated and stuff, that go on Twitter and they put out Azerbaijan talking points, which many believe has been done due to some financial gain? What do you think of those people?
Well, there's people who walk the streets all over the world. They tend to be women in most cases, unfortunately. And they have far more integrity than many of these people because this is not some normal public relations thing that you're doing for Walmart in some country. You're talking about life or death, genocide, ethnic cleansing. So for people who have that moral level of caliber, you cannot have anything but contempt, and sort of honest hatred.
Another narrative is that, which you've mentioned many times before, that Armenia is an island of liberty in a sea of tyranny. A lot of countries around the world have pushed this narrative. I would say some more successfully than others. But do you think that this can gain traction? Do you think that the eyes and ears of the world can gather around this?
Yeah, they can gather around it, definitely. However, we should not fool ourselves. You can say all of that and sort of lay the groundwork, but unless you are prepared, unless you are ready, unless you have the ability to defend yourself and fight for your rights, defend your territorial integrity, defend the human rights of your fellow citizens, all of that doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot, because at the end of the day, you either have that ability or you don't. But you need to have that context, that sort of that narrative, and it's a narrative that is entirely true.
Yes.
There's no hyperbole in it, and I think you constantly want to make that comparison, and you want to put that in that context. Is it a panacea for everything? No, not at all. This is just essentially narrative telling, but narrative telling that isn't backed up by force or your ability to defend yourself is. Will do as much good for us as it has done for the Tibetans, who have won the culture and have won that argument decades ago. But they run against empirical reasons, and you cannot even compare China with the Aliyev regime. But I mean, those are completely different type of things. So winning that is not enough. However, it is a very good starting point. But it's the soft hand and the fist that go together. The public relations wars is the soft hand.
And at the same time, democracy around the world is in crisis. This narrative hasn't worked in a lot of countries. For example, in Africa, several fledgling democracies have now very suddenly turned into military dictatorships. Now, I didn't really see any global narratives converge around it. There was almost a sense of disinterest. My question is, does the world care that Armenia is free and democratic?
No. And it's not going to care. It's about us constantly saying that and forcing their uncomfortable hypocrisies in their face. It is not about changing anything. Most Western countries, frankly, and behind closed doors, would rather deal with totalitarian states. Egypt in the post-revolutionary period was a really troublesome country. Now ruled by a single dictator is a very easy country to deal with. So what the West says about democracy and what they do are completely different things. And we have a democracy and we're free not because to please the West, is because it pleases us. And this is what we need, and this is what we demand. And we never, unlike Ukraine, in which the EU, God knows, the US spent billions of dollars to lay the groundwork for many of the changes there. There was no such effort in Armenia. Whatever we've done, it's been through our own efforts. So no, it isn't, it doesn't matter. I don't think they care about it whatsoever. But it's not our job our job is to point out their hypocrisies. And
another narrative is the tolerance of the society towards minorities. Now, obviously, for example, the LGBTQ community and women, many have had appalling experiences in Armenia. But the state, for example, doesn't actively persecute these groups. You just go south, not so far, into Iran, and the story completely changes. Same goes for ethnic minorities, Yazidis, Kurds, Udis, Assyrians, Molokkans, and also Indians, Arabs, Iranians on the street. Can that be another narrative that is pushed, that Armenian society, maybe it's something cultural or something ingrained or something that is coming from the past, there is this tolerance that doesn't exist in other neighboring countries. Even in Georgia, for example, there is a very active anti-LGBT movement.
I think, definitely it's a narrative that can be pushed. But I think there's nuances here. Armenia's tolerance on many of these issues is not necessarily a Western tolerance. It is almost a what you do with your life is none of my business. type of tolerance, and that people have a right to live their individual lives. And I think the key here is not public attitudes, because we can have public attitudes in this country that are horrendous on many subjects. It's the issue of the state. In Turkey, in Azerbaijan, in Iran, in certain cases, depending on the particular subgroup, the state actively takes part in targeting and persecuting people. The Armenian state does not persecute people, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, sexual minorities. It does not do that. So that in and of itself is a huge narrative to be told. I mean, I'll if you want to know how important this is, if you look at the Olympic ceremony that happened if you look at the changes, the subtle changes in China in 2008, I believe it was if you looked at the opening ceremony of the Olympics, it was almost a martial. You would think it was they were marching off to war. This year's Winter Olympics was about highlighting their 60 ethnic minorities living in China, and the Olympic flame was lit by a Uyghur. Okay, so they understand that this tolerance narrative, even though your state is entirely intolerant, how powerful that is. You take Azerbaijan, and all these bought and paid for writers that will write for them will never write anything without saying it's the land of tolerance and highlight, two Jews that did something here, and whatever that they're highlighted, and how tolerant a society is, when it is a bold-faced lie, because just in the sheer essence, a fascist society cannot be tolerant. Yeah. So it's just a lie in the face of it, but they keep saying it. So what this tells you is how important that narrative is. And we need to highlight this tolerance narrative, open-mindedness narrative, and the lack of hatred and vitriol towards foreigners, which I think is key, that we need to keep talking about. Now, again, lack of vitriol does not mean love, but that hardly means that anywhere in the world.
I mean, that's interesting that Azerbaijan, like you mentioned, an authoritarian dictatorship, pushes the narrative that it's multicultural and non-racist and a cosmopolitan society, but Armenia doesn't so much. Why is that?
Because we're idiots.
Next question. Another hot point, which I think that this is the culmination of what you're talking about, is that Armenians could really find their place in the anti-racism struggle narrative that is just taken over the narratives in the West and the culture war narratives in the West. The Armenian cause, in essence, is part and parcel of the anti-racism cause. So what do you think about that?
That's absolutely true. You name me, I mean, outside of the Jews of Europe in World War II, or the Gypsies, Romani people, whoever else was persecuted during World War II in the German concentration camps, who has a better right to tell how important anti-racism is than Armenians? We were moved off of lands that our people had lived on for millennia because of modernist racist ideas. So this is something we need to be clearly against, loudly against, and tell the world that this is our narrative. Let's take the Artsakh narrative. If you want to, like, for example, we're talking to the Western left. Artsakh was the Spanish Republic. The Spanish Republic in the 1930s was attacked, a democratic state with a lot of problems, granted, by the two primary fascist states using local fascist proxies, and was crushed by them. Shushi is Guernica. That church picture, that's Guernica, the famous Picasso painting. It's a very easy narrative. Fascist state attacks democracy to ethnically cleanse and attempt the genocide of a people. And it's not even not true. It's actually 100% true. We just need to put that in that context. So when you talk about Shushi, people understand you're talking about Guernica. This is you can make the parallels, and if you say it enough, it'll become the dominant narrative.
And because really the topic of racism dominates the conversation in the West now. Even in the media, you see a lot of the stories that hit the headlines are somewhat to do with racism.
Yeah, I mean, it's you can argue if it's overdone. You can argue different angles of it. I mean, those are completely different arguments. But in the ideology of modern popular culture, anti-racism is on top. As far as a principle that you want to, outside of being anti-totalitarian, anti-racism is probably the top two ideas of modern popular culture, as far as its political effects go.
Because I think during the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, there was an attitude in Western audiences and Western circles that conflict was just two poor developing countries that probably in most of their minds two dictatorships or non-democracies just having a brawl and not much else.
No.
Do you have that impression? Do you think that's how the West viewed the 2020 war?
Yeah, the attitude is this. You have two equally unreasonable brown people who are not sophisticated or have not advanced to the level of Belgians and the Dutch and the Flemish to be able to live in one country together. And they're having nationalist wars in the 21st century. So it was, it's this Orientalist attitude, and it's on some levels a racist attitude. And that does not allow, and given the fact that the narrative here was sort of upside down, in the sense that people who looked white, people who are Christians, were the ones being persecuted by people who looked less white and not Christian. And that sort of counters the narrative of what people are used to. If we were Bosnians and they were Serbs, this war would not have lasted as long, and NATO paratroopers would be landing in Shushi. So yes, they have those attitudes, and frankly, we need to call them on it. However, one of the reasons they have that attitude is because we never told the story in a proper way. And we allowed this to be two groups of unreasonable brown people type of narrative, rather than a heroic struggle, a heroic anti-fascist struggle of people who want to live in their ancestral land and not be ethnically cleansed.
But isn't that pill a bit hard to swallow if their attitude is racist, and now we have to peddle the fact that our cause is the cause of anti-racism? I mean, who's responsible, them or us?
Both. We need to make people uncomfortable. Okay. We need to get in people's faces and make them uncomfortable.
And make ourselves uncomfortable.
We have to make ourselves uncomfortable. We have to make them uncomfortable. We have to call them out on their shit and their hypocrisies. And you need to get in their face. So is it a pleasant thing? No, it isn't a pleasant thing. But we don't have time for pleasant things. Our job is to tell the truth, tell it relentlessly, and have it take us where it takes us. And if it makes other people uncomfortable or screws up their narratives, so be it.
I mean, I like your point that this is for the betterment of Armenia. So whether you like it or not, this is the way the game is played. But I'm just curious, when you see these culture wars and culture war narratives in the West, what do you think? Do you think that it's a good progression? Do you think it's something that will get more in the future?
No, it's not. It's in the context of the West, for the most part, it's a waste of time.
Okay. And
it's really distracting from the dominant issues of those societies, because I think there's a direct parallel between the cultural wars and the death of religion. Yes. Because if you look at the passionate way that people will fight over some of these things, you would think that they're medieval monks fighting over, how many angels fit on top of a pin. And I think this comes from if the structure of the old world, of what held the world together, isn't there anymore, then the problem with anti-religion is that when people are not religious, they will essentially find another religion, except it'll be a secular one, or they'll worship the strongest thing next to them.
And it's almost like heresy to, for example, deny climate change, which you may believe is a terrible opinion, is to some people almost immoral. So my next question, I think, is a really interesting topic. I mean, if we align Armenia with those narratives that the cause of anti-racism, democracy, tolerance to minorities, couldn't you alienate other actors in the world? For example, Iran's Islamic regime. We're pushing, for example, that in Armenia, LGBT rights, LGBT people are not persecuted by the state. That could alienate some forces in Tehran. The Kremlin as well, when it comes to democracy, for example. What do you think of that? Could these forces actually rally against Armenia?
No, because these issues in these other countries are used they're used in the context of political benefits in very pragmatic ways. These are not religious beliefs. These are beliefs that, if you look at Russian polling, and most Russians don't approve of LGBT people, well, it's a hell of a lot better to be against them than for them. So it's just good politics. Now, does that extend it to it? These are not sort of ideological red lines, because there's far more relevant and more important issues. So as long as you put this in the context of yourself and not in the context of criticizing others, I don't think they might not like it, but I don't think it's as disruptive as some people might fear.
And isn't Ilham Aliyev the antithesis of the modern Western cultural revolution?
Which makes all of this so pathetic, is because he's totalitarian. He is physically ugly, which actually matters in the context of his language is ugly. Everything that he says, outside of whatever the propagandists write and the bought and paid for ones, is he's the living antithesis to all of this. His family, the way they look, everything about them is there to be demonized. He's almost out of central casting. You could not find a caricature. Of the evil Oriental despot.
Do you think that Armenia can weaponize that against Aliyev?
Absolutely. Absolutely. He is listen, I mean, he'll have always a lot more cover, for example, than people like Erdogan, because there are very specific forces that are always he's got more cover, and he's a country that in the international scheme of things is irrelevant, not as relevant as Turkey. However, when it comes to demonization, he is you could not ask for a better target.
Another question I want to ask, though, is doesn't modern popular culture just kind of dumb down a society?
Absolutely.
Well then, but then if we're trying to push these intelligent narratives, I mean, isn't the audience already numb?
No, I think it's a great mistake. It's not intelligent. It's intelligent objectives. Intelligent objectives sometimes need very dumbed down narratives.
Okay.
It's the objectives that need to be intelligent, not the format of how you get there.
Okay. I think that a lot of Armenians are starting to realize what you're saying. Do you agree?
Well, I mean, I don't talk to hundreds of people every day. I have no idea. I think I shouldn't say. First of all, it's not relevant what I'm saying. I think there's a lot of people that matter. Our understanding that our inability to tell our narrative in a proper way has put us where we're at. I think a lot of people understand that. Now, do they all agree with my approach? I would not say some do, some don't, some are categorically against. But everyone understands that we have failed in telling a proper narrative about this country and our culture.
I mean, more so that the point that you're making, that, for example, certain things should be pushed more. There are examples of countries that have done this remarkably, successfully. One example I wanted to bring was Taiwan. Taiwan is up against China, vastly more powerful militarily, economically. And this small liberal democracy with minority rights has actually managed to have this message ingrained in Western audiences that there's a small island democracy that is facing this gargantuan communist dictatorship. So this could be achieved. Do you have any other examples, or what do you think of the Taiwan example? What do you think when you see the other countries of the world? What can Armenia learn?
Well, I mean, I think Taiwan is a very good example, even though China being so unique, it's a completely different case in many ways, and it's not that hard to demonize China in the Western mindset. Today's China, that is. So it's actually an easier sell. No one knows who the hell Azerbaijan or Aliyev are or is. Everyone knows who China is and how relevant they are, because there's not a person in the world that doesn't wake up in the morning and buy some Chinese product during the day. So China is easier. But I think there's the other examples. I mean, you look at the sort of, I mean, this is somewhat fading, but South Africa post-apartheid is a country that batted way above its weight in so many ways because of what it came through. And it had moral currency, or it used to talk about things that other people could not or would not. Obviously, the Israeli example, in which how they, tell different stories to different groups of people, and they've done a masterful job of that. But I mean, you look at the West. I mean, there's other countries that for a while in the 80s and 90s, the Czech Republic was the darling of the West. Then in the 90s, it was Ireland. There's something in this. There's something in the water of how you tell the story and what the culture represents that is that can make your country stand out. And there's nothing saying that we cannot do the same here. Maybe not to the same level, in a different way, perhaps. But the truth is that this is an attractive culture that you can tell a really wonderful story about, and you have to sit down and tell that story.
I want to go through some cultural buzzwords.
Sure.
And I want you to give your opinion and your take on what these phenomenons are. The first one is a great one: cancel culture. Which first, can you explain what is cancel culture? I
mean, it's sort of an extension of political correctness, where you wipe out ideas that are not acceptable. I think there are actually very few people and things that need to be canceled that are beyond the pale, but that's a very small number of people and a small number of things. For the most part, it's actually it comes out of a totalitarian mindset, to be honest with you, in which you're trying to ban bad ideas. And you cannot ban bad ideas. You can only argue them away. You should not ban them. So I think it's, I don't want to question the motivations of people who are involved with it, but it can quickly turn into a witch hunt and create a backlash that essentially defeats your purpose. So I think overall it's a negative phenomenon.
And obviously in Armenia there are certain sanctities, but generally one thing that's cool about discourses amongst Armenians in Armenia is that there isn't really a cancel culture.
There is not. No, it's this is a in-your-face culture in which everyone will have their opinion, no matter how in a few cases intelligent, or in many cases utterly idiotic, and they'll make sure you understand it.
The second one is nationalism. What do you think when you hear that word?
I think it's problematic even in the best of circumstances, and even though it's entirely understandable, especially for the purposes of small people and their self-preservation. But it's a poison chalice. If it's useful for periods of time, it can easily poison the waters and create atmosphere or distrust where less nationalism would be more useful.
You mean in the sense of nationalist politics, or are you talking more of a John Lennon style imagine?
No. And nationalist politics. Nationalist politics generally, I mean, again, I don't want to be categorical. There is room for this. And nationalism of small countries and small people is about preserving their rights and preserving their countries, is entirely different than nationalism in dominant powers that want to impose their will around the world. But overall, it's much more things can go wrong by the misuse of nationalism than can go right.
What about globalization?
It's just it's almost the air we breathe. It is what it is. It is the primary explanation of our current condition on all fronts.
And the current state of the Western left? Would you say you were a member once of the Western left?
Yeah, I would say that. I think the Western left is in crisis everywhere, especially in Europe, because there's three things that they care about or purport to care about. It's multiculturalism, social democracy, and democracy. And what we have learned, and they have learned at their own cost, is you cannot have all three. You can have 2 out of the 3, but you can't have all 3. The more a society becomes multicultural, the less social democratic it becomes. Because it's no longer a collective that you're taking care of. You're taking care of a multicultural society. You're always worried about, well, why am I getting less than they do? So I think what the left is being marginalized is learning is the contradictions between tolerance, diversity, and social democracy. And social democracy was the big leftist project in the post-war period, and it's essentially failing all over Western Europe, primarily driven by issues like immigration.
Yeah, that's interesting. For example, in the UK, how a lot of parents of schools of Muslim background would be opposed to the teaching of LGBT issues in school. What about Trumpism? Trump or Trumpism?
I think to give him an ism is to give him way too much credit.
What about Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, the Generation X?
I hope. I know they want to go to space, and I'm hoping that they build their stations there, and they go and they live in what is the equivalent of the 4 seasons in space, and leave us alone.
What about this? I wanted to include because it is a cultural phenomenon. Islamism.
Failed project. It's a failed political project. Actually, it's failed wherever it's been tried, and not because of Islam. It's because theocracy is not the answer to the world's problems, and frankly, and never has been.
What about identity politics?
It's about identity and not about politics. I think politics, in some places, it's actually a way not to talk about class. It's a substitute for class politics. Class politics threatens the elites in every country. Identity politics doesn't threaten anybody.
That's interesting. Especially considering that it's the working class that is the most destitute. And yet we divide on identity. What about de-Christianization? Would you say Armenia is de-Christianizing?
Well, as far as Armenia is de-Christianizing, I don't know. I mean, first of all, you had the Soviet experience in which obviously faith became far less relevant. Christianity in Armenia is a very complicated situation because the idea of religion is entirely mixed in with the culture. But do most people know anything about the actual religion? Is actually no, they don't. So in the context of Armenia, it's very hard to say because in some ways you can make the case that this culture de-Christianized or became far less relevantly religious outside of ritual many, many years ago. But that is a very complicated question, and you can't give a flippant answer to it. But de-Christianization in the West is really, you know, when Nietzsche had this thing about you stare into the abyss and it stares back at you, de-Christianization process in the West is the abyss staring back at us.
When do you think that started in the West, the whole de-Christianization?
I think there's two things. I think the death of Christianity in the West actually started with World War I.
Yes.
When essentially all the certainties went away of like, really, you know, why did all these people kill each other for what? I think it's been a process, and I think the post-war period, post-World War II period, and the cultural change of the 60s sort of broke its back, but it broke something that already had stopped existing in real ways in most places. You know, the faith had died in people's hearts a lot long, much before it actually dies in reality.
And another cultural buzzword, cultural appropriation. Can you also explain what that is?
Well, cultural appropriation is, for example, you know, you take something from a culture and you mix it with your own and you advance it. Cultural appropriation, what is silly about it is all of human history is cultural appropriation. Now, obviously, there's negative aspects. I mean, if you see the regime in Baku is trying to take away Armenian writings from Armenian churches in occupied parts of Artsakh, to call it, and mix them up with some imaginary group that they can claim ties to, you know, the ancient Albanians or whatever hell they're talking about. Obviously, it has serious consequences, but appropriation, you know, all of human history is about people taking the best practices of other people and using them. Because if you're not, then you're really stupid, because you take the best from other people and you use it. Whether it's cultural, mechanical, or whatever. So I think this is there's a finite level where it's actually a relevant concern, but for the most part, you're criticizing all of human history.
And I think when most people hear the word culture, they think of art galleries. And, you know, in conclusion, in a summary, if you could give a short takeaway thought from what we were discussing today, what would it be? Culture is about the way we live, and how do you tell a story about the way you live, and most importantly, how is that useful to you? Because this is an everyday thing. How is it useful to you in your day activities, and not simply political ones, in how you approach education and how you approach family relationships? How does it empower you to live your life in a more fulfilling way, or to allow a culture to live its life in a more fulfilling way, by having a coherent set of ideas about itself that can bring people together, but can also be challenged in the sense that they're not stuck in time. Okay. Well, Eric, thank you as always.
Thank you.
And thank you too.